Welcome back. And we turn the page to Kings and Chronicles. Let me ask you, what do you take was the purpose for the book of Kings? I mean, vis-a-vis its first audience. In what ways does the book of Kings advance the progress of Revelation? Given the significant overlap between Kings and Chronicles, how would you compare and contrast these two compositions? So, what seems to be the purpose of Chronicles? Well, previously on Venture in the First Testament, we surveyed that Judges segued into the book of Samuel and saw the aborted attempt to enthrone a king in the person of Gideon, to establish a dynasty, Judges 8, which Gideon saw as an attempt to usurp Yahweh's role as king. And after Gideon died, his son Abimelech thought, boy, this might be something worth pursuing, and trying to leverage his father's reputation, he conspired to become king at Shechem. Well, this didn't turn out so well, and he died by assisted suicide because of a splitting headache. Check that out in the story. But we saw that after that, in time, after Samuel had reached retirement age and the people were put off with his sons, that Israel began to clamor for a king so that they could be more like the Gentiles. And ultimately, God anointed a person after his own heart to serve as king in Israel, and he promised this king a dynasty, an everlasting kingdom, in terms that evoked the promise that God had made to Abraham and Sarah. And so now the book of Kings continues the narrative of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and their case studies of Torah theology. I'd like to suggest a key passage, a key verse for Kings is in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 32. It's a sad verse, but I think it depicts what goes on in the narrative. It goes, in those days, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. This was a predicted consequence of the covenant, of violating the covenant. Remember the blessings and the cursings back in Deuteronomy? See, if I reject God, God rejects me. Well, Chronicles takes another look at the past, this time during the Persian period, in order to help its audience understand that God's covenant hasn't been revoked, that the promise project is still in process, that God's still calling out of the nations a people for his name, Amos 9, that God hasn't dumped his people. As you might guess, the genre of both Kings and Chronicles is theological historical narrative. Both Kings and Chronicles demonstrate God's character. I mean, his amazing grace, his patience, his compassion, his righteousness and justice. Both Kings and Chronicles provide case studies of how humankind falls short of the glory of God. Over and over again, God calls his people, both leaders and rank and file, to get real, to abandon their sin and follow him like Joshua and Caleb and David did with their whole hearts. These narratives demonstrate God's persistence in revealing himself to his people and the world. I mean, sending his servants, the prophets, again and again, like Elijah and Elisha and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Jonah. He sends them to cut through the smog of perverse leadership and false prophets. Kings and Chronicles provide us more case studies in transformational leadership in desperate times. See this in the person of kings and prophets who stand against the tide and those who don't. Both Kings and Chronicles express a philosophy of history that holds that Yahweh is indeed on his throne and he's working out his mission, no matter how intransigent humanity might be. Since the last event that the author reports in Kings is the release of King Jehoiakim from a Babylonian prison, it would seem to indicate that it was written in exile and that it's exegeting why this has happened. And by the same token, since Chronicles closes with a decree from Cyrus, the Persian emperor, that the exiles could return home, we have an indication that it's written in the PostExilic period, and the tone, the tenor, the thrust of the book indicates that its purpose was to encourage a disheartened faith community. Well, whereas the chronicler's audience was well aware of the many failures on the part of those who claim to be God's people, the chronicler demonstrates God's faithfulness, in part by amplifying the importance of the promise project that was first announced back to Adam and Eve and then repeated and explicated to Noah and to Abraham and to David. Think about it. We'll see in a bit.